Chosen one, listen closely, because right now, the truth is being watered down by imagination, and that's exactly how they want it. When people can't face reality, they start creating stories. They exaggerate, they twist facts, they replay events in their head until the truth no longer looks sharp. And this is why the real message gets reduced, because imagination is louder than accountability. What's happening now is not confusion. It's panic disguised as storytelling. They are caught up bad. And when someone is cornered by their own actions, they don't sit in silence. They start calling everyone. Late nights, long conversations, repeating the same story again and again, hoping someone will believe it enough to make it real. They're not seeking peace. They're seeking validation. They're pretending to be the victim, because facing the truth would expose everything they tried to hide. But here's what they don't understand. When you're the chosen one, silence speaks louder than explanations. While they're running phone to phone, voice to voice, you're standing still. And that's what's terrifying them. Because stillness means confidence. Stillness means you don't need to convince anyone. And the more they talk, the more their story changes. The more they explain, the weaker it sounds. This isn't about them missing you. This is about them losing control of the narrative. They thought they could rewrite the story using imagination. But truth doesn't bend. It waits. And right now, the truth is catching up fast. Stay with me till the end of this message, because once you understand why they're acting like victims, you'll also understand why your elevation triggered their downfall, and why nothing they say can stop what's already unfolding. Before we go deeper, you must connect with this energy. Like this video to align with the message. Comment below, "Thank you, God, for protecting me from what was fake." And subscribe to the channel to send your signal to the universe, because messages like this don't find everyone, only the chosen ones. When imagination replaces truth, the message loses power. When imagination replaces truth, the message slowly starts losing its power, and most people don't even realize it's happening. Right now, the biggest problem isn't straight-up lies, it's the stories people create in their own minds to feel comfortable. When someone refuses to accept reality, they don't always deny it openly. Instead, they reshape it. They take what actually happened and soften the sharp edges in their head. They replay moments again and again, changing small details until they no longer feel responsible. Over time, this imagined version feels safer than the real one, because the real one asks uncomfortable questions. The imagined version says, "You did your best, you were misunderstood, you were the victim." And that's where the problem starts. Imagination becomes a shield. It protects people from guilt, from shame, and from facing their own role in the situation. Rather than sitting with the truth and growing from it, they escape into a version of the story where they look cleaner and more innocent. This isn't done to hurt others, it's done to avoid pain. But the cost of that avoidance is huge. When imagination takes over, honesty disappears quietly. The person isn't trying to lie, they genuinely begin to believe their edited version of events. What once was a clear truth becomes blurry, then distant, and eventually unrecognizable. As imagination grows stronger, accountability feels threatening. Fantasy feels gentle. In fantasy, no one has to apologize. No one has to admit mistakes. No one has to say, "I was wrong." And because of that, the real message, the one that could bring growth, healing, or closure, gets watered down. It loses its sharpness. It loses its urgency. Instead of learning from what happened, people stay stuck, defending a story that never fully existed. This is also how made-up pain begins to feel real. When someone repeats their imagined version often enough, especially to themselves, the emotions attached to it become intense. They start feeling hurt over things that weren't done to them in the way they claim. They feel wronged, betrayed, or attacked, not because that's the full truth, but because their mind has built a narrative that supports those feelings. The pain feels real, but it's rooted in distortion, not clarity. And once that happens, everything starts to fall apart slowly. Relationships break without understanding. Conversations turn into arguments. Growth stops. Healing gets delayed. All because imagination was chosen over truth. Truth may be uncomfortable, but it's stable. Imagination feels good in the moment, but it collapses under pressure. When reality eventually pushes back, as it always does, the person feels confused, overwhelmed, and exposed. That's when they realize that avoiding the truth didn't protect them. It only postponed the lesson. Real power comes from facing what actually happened, not from rewriting it. Truth may sting at first, but it builds strength. Imagination may feel safe, but it weakens the foundation. And when the foundation is weak, nothing built on it can last. Panic makes people talk too much. When panic takes over, it changes the way people behave, and one of the clearest signs is how much they start talking. A person who is truly at peace doesn't feel the need to explain themselves again and again. Calm people trust that the truth will stand on its own. But panic is different. Panic is noisy, restless, and urgent. It pushes people to speak even when silence would serve them better. That's why, in moments like this, you'll notice them calling everyone, late at night, early in the morning, repeating the same story to different people, hoping it lands somewhere. This kind of talking isn't about sharing feelings or healing. It's about control. When someone feels the ground slipping beneath them, their first instinct is to grab onto something, anything, that makes them feel safe. Words become that lifeline. By talking, they feel like they're doing something, like they're staying ahead of the situation. Deep down, they're afraid that if they stay quiet, the truth will move forward on its own, without their input. And that thought scares them more than anything else, so they rush to speak first. They want their version planted everywhere before facts have a chance to breathe. They believe that if enough people hear their side early enough, the outcome can be influenced. This isn't confidence. It's fear dressed up as urgency. Real confidence doesn't scramble for attention. It doesn't need to convince. It waits. Panic, on the other hand, can't sit still. It needs immediate reassurance, immediate agreement, immediate comfort. What makes this pattern even more revealing is how repetitive it becomes. The same phrases get reused. The same explanations are told again and again. Over time, their words start losing weight. Listeners may nod, but they can feel something is off. The energy behind the words feels rushed, defensive, and strained. Even without meaning to, the person begins to sound desperate, because desperation leaks through tone, timing, and intensity. Another thing panic does is remove awareness. In their rush to talk, people don't realize they're exposing themselves. Every extra explanation opens new gaps. Every added detail creates more room for inconsistency. They think speaking more will protect them, but often it does the opposite. It creates confusion, suspicion, and fatigue in the people listening. Meanwhile, the person who stays quiet appears stronger without trying. Silence in this situation doesn't mean weakness or fear. It means trust. Trust that truth doesn't need constant maintenance. Trust that what's real doesn't require late-night phone calls to survive. Panic talks because it's running out of time. Peace stays quiet because it knows time is on its side. Excessive talking is not a sign of being wronged. It's a sign of being afraid. Afraid of being seen clearly. Afraid of losing control of the story. Afraid that once the noise stops, reality will speak for itself. And when that happens, no amount of talking can undo what was always true. Playing the victim is easier than facing guilt. Taking responsibility is one of the hardest things a person can do because it forces them to look at themselves honestly. It requires courage to say, "I made a mistake," or "I played a role in this." Not everyone is ready for that level of self-awareness. That's why, for many people, playing the victim feels like the easier option. It doesn't demand growth. It doesn't demand accountability. It only demands imagination. And imagination is far more comfortable than guilt. When someone chooses the victim role, the first thing they do is flip the story. Slowly, quietly, they rearrange events in their mind until the focus is no longer on what they did, but on how they felt. They stop asking, "What was my part in this?" and start asking, "Why did this happen to me?" By doing this, they shift all responsibility outward. Suddenly, someone else becomes the problem. Someone else becomes the cause. This shift brings temporary relief because it removes the pressure to change. They begin to describe themselves as misunderstood. They say their intentions were pure, but no one listened. They claim they were attacked, judged, or abandoned, even when the reality was more complex. These labels help them protect their self-image. Being the victim feels safer than being imperfect. In their mind, it's better to be wronged than to be wrong. And the more they repeat this version of events, the more real it feels to them. But this isn't healing. Healing requires honesty, and honesty requires discomfort. Playing the victim avoids both. It allows a person to stay emotionally stuck while appearing hurt instead of responsible. On the surface, it looks like pain. Underneath, it's fear. Fear of facing the truth, and fear of losing the identity they've built around being good or right. Deep down, though, they know the truth. It never fully disappears. It shows up in quiet moments, in sudden defensiveness, in the need to explain themselves too much. They may not admit it out loud, but internally, there's an awareness that the story they're telling isn't complete. Admitting the full truth would crack the image they're protecting, and that feels threatening. So they keep choosing the easier path, even though it costs them growth. What they don't realize is that avoiding responsibility doesn't remove guilt, it just buries it. And buried guilt doesn't heal, it leaks. It shows up as anger, blame, resentment, or constant self-justification. The victim role becomes a prison disguised as protection. True strength comes from owning your part, even when it's uncomfortable. It comes from saying, "I could have done better," without collapsing under shame. That's how real freedom begins. Playing the victim may feel easier in the moment, but facing guilt is what actually brings peace. Your silence is what's destroying them. Your silence is doing more damage than any argument ever could, and that's because it carries a kind of power they don't understand. You're not raising your voice. You're not sending long messages to explain your side. You're not trying to prove anything. And that absence of reaction is what's unsettling them the most. They expected resistance. They expected emotional chaos. They expected you to fight back or break down. Instead, they were met with calm, and calm feels threatening to people who rely on confusion to survive. Silence from a chosen one is not emptiness. It's certainty. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and what's true, even when others are trying to rewrite the story. When someone is secure in themselves, they don't rush to defend their character. They understand that truth doesn't need constant explanation. This kind of silence sends a clear message without words. I know where I stand. And that clarity is deeply uncomfortable for people who are unsure of their own position. What makes your silence even more powerful is that it removes their leverage. They wanted a reaction, so they could point to it. They wanted emotional responses they could twist or use as proof of their version of events. But by staying calm, you've taken that away. There's nothing for them to grab onto. No outbursts to highlight. No messages to screenshot. No anger to provoke. That lack of material leaves them exposed to their own behavior. Silence also creates space, and space allows truth to surface naturally. When there's no noise to distract from reality, patterns become obvious. Inconsistencies stand out. People start noticing what doesn't add up, not because you said anything, but because you didn't. Your calm allows others to observe without being influenced by drama. And once people start seeing clearly, lies lose their grip. Anger can be dismissed. Loud reactions can be labeled as emotional or unstable. But calm cannot be argued with. Calm doesn't contradict itself. Calm doesn't rush. That's why it exposes dishonesty faster than confrontation ever could. The more composed you remain, the more frantic they become, and that contrast tells the story on its own. What's destroying them isn't your silence alone, it's what your silence represents. It shows growth, it shows self-respect, it shows that you no longer need external validation. And when someone realizes they can't control you through emotion anymore, panic sets in. You didn't have to say a word to shift the power. Your stillness did it for you. The story keeps changing because it's not real. When a story keeps changing, it's usually because it was never built on something solid in the first place. Real experiences don't shift every time they're retold. Truth has a natural stability to it. It may be uncomfortable, but it stays consistent because it actually happened the way it did. When someone's version of events keeps changing from person to person, that's a clear sign that imagination has taken over. They're not adjusting details to be clearer. They're adjusting them to feel safer. You might notice how one person hears one explanation, while someone else hears a completely different one. The tone changes. The details change. Even the emotions attached to the story seem to move around. This happens because the story is being shaped in the moment, based on who is listening. Instead of truth guiding the narrative, fear does. They say what they think will get sympathy, agreement, or protection. That constant adjustment is exhausting, but they don't see another option. Truth doesn't need editing. It doesn't need to be softened for some people and sharpened for others. It doesn't require rehearsal. When something is real, a person can tell it once and stand by it, even if others don't like it. But when a story is built on imagination, it has to be maintained. It has to be defended. It has to be updated constantly to avoid exposure. That's why the talking never stops. As they continue explaining, small cracks start to appear. A timeline doesn't line up. A motive doesn't make sense. Something said yesterday doesn't match what's being said today. These aren't dramatic moments. They're subtle. But people notice. They may not call it out immediately, but their trust quietly shifts. Confusion replaces belief. Doubt creeps in. Not because you pointed anything out, but because inconsistency always raises questions. What's interesting is that the more they talk, the more fragile the story becomes. Each retelling adds pressure. Each added detail becomes another thing to remember, another thing to keep straight. Over time, the effort of holding the story together becomes visible. It starts to feel forced, overly explained, or emotionally exaggerated. And when that happens, listeners begin to sense that something isn't right. Meanwhile, truth remains simple. It doesn't chase understanding. It doesn't change shape to please different audiences. It just exists. And because it exists quietly, it gives others space to compare what they're hearing with what they're observing. That's when the inconsistencies stand out clearly. This is about control, not pain. What's really happening here has very little to do with pain, and almost everything to do with control. If this were about genuine hurt, the response would look very different. There would be reflection, space, and eventually acceptance. But instead, what you're seeing is constant involvement, managing conversations, checking reactions, correcting narratives. That behavior doesn't come from loss of connection. It comes from loss of control. They're not struggling because you're gone. They're struggling because they can no longer decide how others see you. For a long time, they were comfortable controlling the story. They knew which version of events would be shared, what role you were assigned, and how they appeared in comparison. As long as you stayed inside that narrative, explaining yourself, reacting emotionally, or trying to be understood, they felt safe. But the moment you stepped back, the moment you stopped participating, the narrative broke. You didn't argue for your image. You didn't defend your character. You simply removed yourself. And that's when fear entered. Control gives people a sense of security. When they can guide opinions, they feel powerful. When they can shape conversations, they feel protected. Losing that ability makes them feel exposed. Now they can't predict what people will think of you. They can't frame your silence. They can't control the meaning others assign to your absence. That uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable, especially for someone who relies on influence rather than truth. This is why they're suddenly so focused on perception. They're watching who talks to whom. They're adjusting stories depending on the audience. They're trying to stay ahead of conclusions that are no longer in their hands. It's not about missing you emotionally. It's about missing the role they played in defining you. When you walked away quietly, you took that role with you. Fear always follows loss of control. When people can't manage outcomes anymore, they start managing impressions. They worry about what's being said when they're not present. They worry about what people might realize on their own. And that worry drives behavior that looks like concern but is actually panic. The harder they try to steer opinions, the more obvious it becomes that something is slipping. What they don't understand is that control only works when both sides participate. The moment you stop engaging, control collapses. Silence creates space, and space invites observation. People begin forming their own impressions, free from influence. And once that happens, no amount of conversation management can undo it. This isn't about emotional pain from separation. It's about the discomfort of losing authority over a story they once managed. You didn't expose them. You didn't correct the record. You simply stepped out. And that was enough. When control disappears, fear takes its place. And fear always reveals more than it hides. Truth doesn't chase, it arrives on its own time. Truth has a very different nature than lies or imagination. It doesn't run after people. It doesn't argue for attention. It doesn't need to be defended or pushed forward. Truth moves in its own time, quietly and steadily, and that's why it's so powerful. When you understand this, you realize there is no need to expose anyone or force anything into the open. What's real always finds its way to the surface on its own. Right now, it may feel like the loudest voices are winning. The ones explaining too much, talking too fast, and repeating themselves seem to be everywhere. But noise is not strength, it's urgency. The louder someone gets, the more they're trying to cover something. Truth doesn't compete with that noise. It waits. It allows the chaos to burn itself out. While imagination scrambles to be believed, truth stays still, knowing time will do the work. This waiting period can be uncomfortable, especially if you're used to defending yourself or correcting misunderstandings. Silence may feel like weakness at first, but it's actually trust in a deeper process. Truth doesn't need immediate validation. It doesn't panic when misunderstood. It understands that clarity comes in moments, not arguments, and when that moment arrives, truth doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't need to. It simply becomes obvious. When truth finally speaks, it doesn't shout. It lands. It lands in realization. It lands in sudden understanding. People don't need long explanations at that point. They connect the dots on their own. Patterns become clear. Inconsistencies make sense. What once felt confusing suddenly feels simple. That impact is far stronger than any confrontation because it's internal. It can't be argued with. What's imagined, on the other hand, depends on constant effort. It needs reinforcement, agreement, and repetition. Without attention, it fades. Without support, it collapses. Truth doesn't have this weakness. Even when ignored, it remains intact. Even when buried, it stays unchanged. Time only strengthens it. This is why what's real always outlasts what's imagined. Fantasy may move fast, but it burns out. Truth moves slow, but it endures. You don't need to chase outcomes or force justice. Let time do its work. Let reality reveal itself naturally. When it does, it will be undeniable, not because it was pushed, but because it was true all along. This is confirmation of your elevation. This situation isn't happening by accident, and it's not happening to punish you. It's happening to confirm your elevation. When you outgrow an old cycle, things don't always end quietly. Sometimes they end with exposure, confusion, and people revealing sides of themselves you never had to see before. That's exactly what's happening now. Your growth didn't attack anyone, but it did change the environment. And when you rise, what no longer belongs starts slipping out of place. One of the clearest signs that you've elevated is that their mask couldn't stay on anymore. You didn't confront them. You didn't force the truth. You didn't demand explanations. You simply changed your energy, your boundaries, your standards, and that shift created pressure. Under pressure, pretending becomes hard to maintain. The role they were playing around you no longer worked because you stopped responding the way you used to. That's when the cracks started to show. It's important to understand that choosing peace doesn't mean you were weak or avoidant. It means you learned discernment. You realized that not every situation deserves your emotional investment. You chose clarity over chaos and self-respect over proving a point. That decision alone marks growth. People who are still operating from old patterns see that as a threat because it reminds them of where they're stuck. You didn't do anything wrong by stepping back. You didn't abandon anyone. You simply stopped carrying what wasn't yours to carry. And when you let go, the imbalance became obvious. They're still explaining, still defending, still justifying things that no longer matter to you. Meanwhile, you've already moved forward mentally and emotionally. That gap between you and them is the elevation. Let them talk. Let them repeat their stories. Let them pretend if they need to. None of it changes where you are now. Growth doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like being misunderstood by people who only knew the older version of you. What matters is this: you broke the cycle. You chose a higher way of being. And this situation is proof that the old dynamics no longer have power over you. You're not stuck explaining yesterday. You're building tomorrow. And that's how you know you've truly risen.